silence.
Oh, no, that's all right. Just let me give me something. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is talk about how social class has disappeared, how and various ways in which this has happened. I'm also then going to talk about how this is sort of a bad idea, and the people are arguing that social class has to be rethought and reconceptualized, but it can't be reconceptualized in a sort of deterministic manner because of the various theories and various theoretical modes that have happened. And I'm going to try to talk about how to reconceptualize class in light of these theories. In a way, this is an opportunity to begin to think about, I mean, there's various movements around the world now talking about the need for an alternative world. And there's implications for what I'm going to talk about, trying to, how you can escape, in a sense, from the present to bring about this world that many people are talking about throughout the world in terms of creating an alternative. And so this is what I'm trying to accomplish. Okay? So the first part is an introduction. Some critics argue that social class has disappeared from sociological discourse, while others claim that this focus has returned. The idea in any case is that class is an important issue that needs to be discussed seriously. But what about the charge that sociologists over the years have lost interest in class? How is such a claim plausible? Those who fault sociology, nonetheless, believe that class has been eclipsed by other less significant contributions. Specifically, the so-called politics of identity has been identified as a culprit in this debacle. And because of emphasizing race and gender, for example, the erosion of the middle class, along with the utter destruction of the working class, has not received special attention from anyone but a few Marxists nowadays. Although the confluence, these are words people use, the confluence and intersection of these factors with class is being mentioned regularly, critics contend that the result has been the dissolution of the impact of the economy. Class conflict, in other words, has been replaced by analyses of the subject, or subjectivity, and how persons are perceived or perceive themselves. For example, the construction, nature, and distortion of identity, along with pleasure and desire, have been given a lot of attention. But of course, as Cornel West states, race matters. But critics wonder whether this point has been made to the expense of class. In the end, but especially in the 1980s, a lot of attention was devoted to examining the most recent stage of capitalism. The claim was that fast, or late capitalism represents something qualitatively different from the past. Accordingly, the traditional class arrangements were becoming fuzzy and the accompanying conflicts muted. During this decade, for example, the vast majority of persons identified themselves as middle class. The assumption was that anyone could purchase the material and symbols of status necessary to achieve this mobility. And with credit extended as never before, in addition to the arrival of new financial schemes, class barriers were overlooked by both average persons and pundits. Nonetheless, despite these claims, race and gender exist within a much larger context known as capitalism. And although race or gender relations, not to mention expectations, might improve, class is lurking in the background to inhibit progress even in these areas. The specific context that critics cite as relevant nowadays is the unique mode of capitalism that has emerged in the last 20 years. They argue additionally that this emphasis on race and gender is consistent with this neoliberal trend. As Margaret Thatcher declared during the 1980s, along with postmodernists such as Baudrillard, the social is no longer relevant. Although this reaction is extreme, a particular philosophy has emerged that calls into question the use of abstractions such as society or the social system to explain behavior. Habermas, for example, has labeled this reorientation the post-metaphysical term. Within this new theoretical framework, the disappearance of the social makes sense, and much can be learned from this theoretical maneuver. Postmodern critique. Post-metaphysics owes a lot to the arrival of postmodernism, although some other philosophies make similar epistemological maneuvers. Particularly noteworthy is the work by Jean-Francois Lyotard. Traditionally, however, society has been conceived in a realistic manner. Realism evolves around the conceptual axis provided by Auguste Comte, Durkheim, and Tucker-Parsons. Borrowing from Durkheim, society is envisioned by realists to exist sui generis. The social, in other words, transcends individuals and provides the normative base of society, which also establishes an unbelievable foundation for assimilation and uniformity. Parsons elaborated on this theme by introducing structural metaphors, such as roles and their linkages, to describe how society operates. The point of this maneuver is twofold. First, society appears to be substantial and worthy of study, and second, an autonomous framework is available to enforce social control. With respect to understanding class, realism is very helpful. Marxists often declare, class relates to an objective position and structural barriers that determine the opportunities of persons. Although class may have a psychological component based on personal beliefs and perception, social structure should not be ignored and constitutes an intractable reality for these theories. But realism cannot survive the onslaught of postmodernism. Lyotard described postmodern philosophy as incredulity toward meta-narratives. These stories are grand tales that are assumed to be universal, and thus are invoked to explain social phenomena and events. In this case, structure could constitute a meta-narrative. Central to postmodernism is a specific anti-realist gambit inspired by the late work of Wittgenstein. What both writers contend is that language is a game, and how persons play the game prescribes the nature of reality. Their point is that language is not merely descriptive, but influences how knowledge and order are perceived. Rather than autonomous and constituting, as Roland Barthes says, the outside or other side of language, reality is mediated fully by speech acts. And in the end, what constitutes the normative base of society is thus fundamentally a linguistic habit. Most important is that this philosophy undermines the dualism at the heart of realism. Social realism is possible, in other words, because the prospect of establishing an autonomous and thus universal normative foundation is possible. Subsequent to the views of Wittgenstein and later Lyotard, such autonomy is impossible to sustain legitimately. The use of structures to describe social functions and is thus considered to be passé. The reason for this conclusion is quite simple. Structures do not have the autonomy necessary to cause or prevent anything from occurring. As a result, stability is always fleeting due to the elusive nature of interpretation. The next section is the collapse of the social, resulting from which has happened. Clearly, the study of social class has benefited from realism. Indeed, the injuries influenced by class are very real and have been documented closely by social sciences. The impact of structures can be measured and clearly illustrated. Postmodernists objected, however, to this portrayal of social life. They argued quite successfully that realist imagery is abstract and fails to appreciate the intricacies of how social barriers are constructed, interpreted, legitimized, or internalized. Consequently, little insight is provided to how class actually operates other than as an obstacle. But this knowledge of what Foucault calls the microphysics of power has been purchased at a high price, argue Marxists and other critics of postmodernism. Their key objection is that along with structure, class has been wiped away. But what became apparent is that the neoliberal agenda thrived under this condition. In fact, some commentators maintain that the theoretical maneuver made by postmodernists reinforces neoliberalism. What occurred is that the status reserved traditionally for the social was undermined by this focus on language games. As a result, society could be nothing more than a collective of individuals who gather periodically at the marketplace. The individual is thus sovereign and nothing else. Hence, persons became known as consumers, who clamor for the status that sociologists often mistake for class. The obstacles prescribed by class standing were dismissed as excuses for laziness or the inability to take productive advantage of opportunities. Persons were presumed to be liberated from former constraints so they could exhibit their creativity and fulfill themselves. All that is necessary now for advancement are personal and social capital. In the first case, certain skills might be acquired, for example, through education. In the second, social networks might have to be cultivated. In each instance, however, the failure to obtain the necessary capital is a personal issue. With individuals treated as atoms, who seek little more than personal actualization, society disappears. The collective is sometimes mentioned, but only in the most vague terms. Any limitations that might be encountered do not restrict a class of persons, and any apparent collective effort is purely accidental. The social, therefore, collapses into a morass of claims and counterclaims. In fact, structural barriers are dismissed as remnants of inappropriate and truly ineffective ways of conceptualizing social existence. And since no social system exists, any discussion of targeted interventions is irrelevant. The best policy is simply to free persons from any social fetters and encourage them to pursue their personal goals. Now I'm going to try to talk a little bit about class without structure, because my basic argument here, obviously, is that class is very important and it's been dismissed through a variety of means. But this latest maneuver made by postmodernists made it impossible to resurrect class in the typical Marxist way, a deterministic way. And I'm going to try to argue that we need to rethink class so that we can still talk about the damages brought about by class, but don't do it in such a deterministic way that was done in the past. That's what's coming. Class without structure. Over the years, however, sociologists have documented quite clearly the effects of class. Class standing has been illustrated to influence, for example, arrest rates, college admissions, and healthcare options. This association is real and not simply leftist propaganda. These results could not be ignored forever and became especially evident following the fundamental or structural economic changes initiated in the 1980s. But postmodernists provided social scientists with a valuable lesson. That is, the influence of class is quite nuanced, and persons do not respond uniformly to changes in the economy. And any such changes, additionally, are not necessarily manifested in cultural areas related to the reduction of racism or sexism. In Marxist terms, the so-called base does not automatically shape the superstructure in a cultural manner, which I'm sure you've heard this language regularly. How class operates, for example, depends on a person's biography, identity, and cultural heritage. The economy might dominate eventually other aspects of society, but this influence is quite circuitous, it's quite indirect. Any reintroduction of class, therefore, should not be simplistic and would have to include the element of interpretation. Specific attention would have to be given to how class is socially constructed, including the possible ways of personal and group reactions to any barriers. In other words, class would have to be treated as real and influential, but not something that operates in a mechanistic manner. In a capitalist system, certain rules could be operative and expected to be enforced, while a realist portrayal of these laws is rejected. I mean, really what I'm taking on here is Habermas. In a sense, Habermas worries that as a result of postmodernism, there's no rule, there's no way any longer to have a critique of capitalism because there's no base for making such judgments. And I'm arguing that's wrong. That you can still talk about capitalism, you can still talk about class, but you have to do it in a different way. Okay? The use of structural metaphors to illustrate this process, accordingly, would distort how class functions. But with this in mind, Bourdieu set out to conceptualize a new social order. Because he recognized the legitimacy of the post-metaphysical position, specifically the role accorded to active cognition, he could not continue the use of structural terminology. As a result, he resurrected an old term and referred to normative order as habitus. His point is that class, for example, could be both normative and elusive, and social theory would have to cope effectively with this ambiguity. When understood as habitus, Bourdieu thought that class could be understood as real without becoming a reality sui generis. The idea is basically that class is not natural, like a structure, but a social construction. The resulting norms and priorities, however, can be made to appear universal as if they are an outgrowth of something basic. In other words, by making this maneuver, class can be still perceived as real, but not necessarily understood in a mechanistic manner. Based on this ideology, certain commitments can be envisioned to be structural inevitabilities. Any person that joins a society, either through birth or immigration, is expected to internalize these norms. In this way, capitalism can be said to operate according to laws. Once persons are inside this economic system, they are expected to voice certain beliefs, adopt a particular logic, and behave in particular ways, and are going to be sanctioned for not doing so. Consequently, the image of economic laws is created. In the words of Louis Althusser, in the last instance, the economy is dominant, due to the logic of capitalism and the accompanying values and priorities. But this doesn't mean, just because he says it's dominant in the last instance, doesn't mean that it's dominant in a universal manner. But what is essential to capitalism? At the heart of this economic system are private ownership and the concentration of wealth and the power that follows from this modus operandi. Economic democracy, therefore, is not likely to become vital or essential trait of this style of economy. Gender and racial liberty and equality, however, may not run into conflict immediately with these basic principles. If ideology operates correctly, a particular perspective on the economy is understood to transcend historical contingencies. And accordingly, the presence of a hierarchical class is described to fulfill basic needs in human beings, for example, to differentiate themselves from others. The aim of this discussion right now is to avoid reifying class, since this task is accomplished through ideology. Most important, instead, is that the illusion of a permanent class structure can be systematically created. But what this constructive perspective on class reveals is that criticism of any barriers is possible. Persons may, according to specific assumptions and circumstances, be limited by class, but they are not trapped in these conditions. We're almost done. The social matters. I have 6 minutes, so that'll be fine. The key point of post-metaphysics is that all views of knowledge and order are social. Every position, in other words, emanates from one perspective or another. And given the anti-dualistic character of this output, a so-called natural tendency or propensity lacks justification. A class system, therefore, is never neutral, but represents certain interests. As Stanley Fish declares, what is revealed by the post-metaphysical position is that all social phenomena are political. In other words, a particular decision is made that shapes the reality in one way or another. Certain options are selected and thus simultaneously exclude others. The question then becomes, who benefits from the prevailing system of stratification? Who has the most to gain from the two societies, the super rich and the rest, that are emerging in most countries around the world? Clearly, the majority of persons who are poor and losing economic ground almost daily are hardly the beneficiaries. Yet the upper classes continue to opine that more time is necessary for everyone through the miracle of the market to achieve mobility. Yet almost every day, more interventions are required in the form of rebates, bailouts, and other policy mandates to maintain the image that the market is neutral and working. But within the context of post-metaphysics, claims about universality, necessity, or inevitability constitute a cynical political ploy. Specifically noteworthy is that particular interests are able to hide behind the facade of neutrality. In this way, the real political character of the economy, and thus the class system, is concealed from the public. Given this portrayal, post-metaphysics does not necessarily lead to pessimism about the inevitable causes and the results of class. The result of this position is not only that class is problematic, but that any social arrangements, including stratification systems and similar institutions, is based on assumptions that are neither neutral nor natural. And thus alternatives can be offered without the fear that such proposals violate some social or natural law. To invoke Bourdieu's imagery, a particular class system is a habitus that can be rethought or abandoned altogether without falling into questions about human nature or so-called ultimate foundations. Conclusion, very short. Many protest movements nowadays are asking whether another world is possible. When entire segments of the world facing seemingly intractable class barriers and becoming more impoverished, alternatives are certainly welcome. But before such a world can be engaged, persons have to resurrect their imagination. In this regard, they will have to jettison the prevailing realism, known in some circles as capitalist realism, that disregards these proposals as nothing but utopianism. The usual refrain is that an equitable society is a dream that could never be realized due to the fundamental nature of humans. Nonetheless, the thrust of this discussion is that these pessimistic claims represent a powerful ideology, and that this perspective, moreover, is likely to serve special interests at the expense of a lot of persons. Additionally, as a habitus, the current view of human nature, or class destiny, should never be treated as something firmly anchored. Any stratification system, even one linked to capitalism, rests on various commitments and priorities that are not necessarily sacrosanct. What this view of norms suggests is that a more critical approach to class is needed. And as a form of habitus, sustained by idolatry, class can be transformed into an inviolable barrier. And when conceived in this manner, the injuries incurred often provoke minimal response. After all, what can be done in the face of such a dominant system? Yet a habitus is never autonomous. even when sustained by an immense ideological or political apparatus. And assumed by this challenge to realism is that any absolute justification for class divisions and the accompanying clashes dissolves. With this news, all that is needed is the political will to see an alternative vision, exercise some imagination, abandon the pragmatic reflex that seems so common, seems so prevalent, in order to bring about a novel outlook. Thank you.